I don't suppose any of us are immune to overthinking, and this Monday morning we're going to talk a little bit about anybody that tells you they haven't made a mistake or hadn't overthought something is either not telling the truth or they're perfect. And I think which one of those is most likely to be the case. And the original emissions diagnosis manual for Fords was called the H manual. Now, I went to Ford's electronic engine control school in 1986, I guess it was, and they taught us this book here was the Bible of how to fix Ford electronic engine control systems. And fuel injection was just becoming prevalent then. It came out in 1985 on Ford pickups and in 86 on Crown Victorias, and it started basically by 1988 all the carburetors were gone, and that's what everybody was pretty much comfortable with. Some of those carburetors could be a bear to fix. Anyway, they would say something like, measure voltage at terminal A, is it more than 4 volts? If yes, go to page 2. Is it less than 2 volts? Go to page 3. They didn't tell you what to do if it was between those two values. They didn't tell you it was normal or everything was okay or anything. They would just tell you where to go if it was above or below. And there was, like if you had an engine coolant temperature sensor you suspected was not, giving you true readings, they wanted you to have the engine running and warmed up, and they wanted you to unplug the sensor with the engine running and measure the resistance of the sensor with a meter. And when I came back from electronic engine control school, I went around and around with that book for about a week, and I realized it was leading me in circles, and I wasn't fixing anything. This was ridiculous. But anyway, the Ford, though, did not have scan tool data as far as reading live data with a scan tool until 1988, and it first appeared on the Continental. But General Motors had it way back in the real early 80s, and it was their system was really good. Chrysler, I don't remember when they came out with it, but Chrysler's data stream was blistering fast, even on their OBD1 systems. And but before we had a window into the system that we could use for a scan tool, it was a whole different world. And so what I've decided to do whenever I put that H book back on the shelf is I started gathering an understanding of what the voltages on all these sensors were supposed to be when everything was normal. As a matter of fact, I even built I put a piece of shrink tubing on a coat hanger, straight piece of coat hanger with an alligator clip at the top of the coat hanger, and I sharpened the other end of that coat hanger to where it was needle sharp. And even if the sensor was really difficult to get to, I could get the tip of that thing into that wire enough so I could read the voltage. And I fixed all kinds of vehicles by measuring voltages. Oxygen sensor voltage was another thing I'd measure in addition to the throttle position and the map sensor. Map sensor, now you measured that in hertz on the Fords. Now you measure it in voltage on your GM cars and all. But like for instance, somebody would have one that was, running awful and terribly lean and all that, and I would check the map sensor at sea level. It ought to be 158 to 159 hertz. Now when the barometric pressure changes, that's going to wiggle a little bit, but I would go in there, if I checked it and saw it reading 140 with the engine off, I would know instantly it thought it was at high altitude, because it measured at the barometric pressure before you started it, and then when you started it, it started reading engine vacuum because it knew the engine was running and all that. And so after I put that aside, I started measuring those voltages. And Ford had this Best Ideas magazine that they would come out with, and you could actually send in ideas to that Best Ideas magazine. This is an older copy of it from '79, and when I was doing it, it was in the late 80s, early 90s. And I sent a bunch of, I come up with all kinds of ideas that I could send in. Some of them were really simple. One of them I had demonstrated in an earlier video was when I make a little horseshoe-shaped piece of heavy, like welding wire, not welding wire, but welding rod bent into a horseshoe with alligator clips on each side of it to hold the wire while it acts as a heat sink. It also holds the wire stick while you're soldering them and all that, and then you slide your heat shrink over, it makes a better solder joint and all that. But each one of these was $100 that I got for these Best Ideas. And one of the best ideas contest winners I got, one of the first ones, was checking voltages instead of checking the ohms of the sensors. And the following year, as I remember, it was either 87 or 88 was the following year of when I sent this in. They changed all of the diagnostic routines in these Ford manuals to measure in voltages instead of doing it the way they had been doing it. And plus I got a little plaque to hang on the wall and all that. Well, whenever info from good cars has been stored in your personal memory bank or in your computer in the form of oscope patterns, you're a lot more likely to recognize a bad pattern if you know what good patterns look like. Secret Servicemen look at real money, so they'll know how to recognize fake money. They don't study fake money. They look at real money, and they get to where they know real money so well that as soon as they see a fake bill, they know. That's the same thing here. If you know what the voltage is, what the patterns, whether it be a scan tool trace like this or a scope trace, if you know what it's supposed to look like and what it usually looks like when it's working right, you can look at a bad pattern instantly. One time I was working on a Ford Contour that felt really funny whenever it was shifting up through its gears. And so I got a recording of it using the Service Bay diagnostic system, which we had the capability to do that. Uploaded it, looked at it on the screen, and I said, well, I see the gear shifts, I see the RPM responding to that. So I don't really know what to do with this, although I know there's a problem, I can't recognize it looking here. So there was another Contour that was a new one, about the same, it was the same year model, in the next Service Bay, and I asked the guy that was working on it, I said, let me drive this with this flight recorder on it. And I drove it the same way I had driven the one I was working on, made a recording, and put both of those recordings on the screen. If you compared those two recordings, you could instantly see what was wrong with the problem car because of the way the shifts looked on the screen. The shifts were smooth and like a hump on the because of the way the engine controller was detorquing it between shifts and all. But on the problem car, they were dropping off really sharply. And I don't remember what the problem was with that car, but I do remember it was something the transmission guy had to do to straighten it out. It wasn't a drivability problem as much as it was a driveline problem. And it may have even had the wrong fluid in it or something. I can't remember what it was, but I do remember it was easier to see it when I compared it to a known good car. Another thing that they did to us was whenever they were putting all these black boxes on these cars, when they first started doing these modules and everything, they really didn't know how to tell you to figure out what was wrong. And it would come to a point in your trouble tree when you had proved out all of your sensors and connections and everything that it might be the module, but they weren't sure, and they would say substitute a known good module. Well, that's fine if you've got a known good module, but how many of us keep known good modules laying around? I mean, I had a few of them that I had collected, that, but I didn't have one for everything that I needed, But measuring those voltages, whether I was working on an ABS system or whether I was working on engine controls or anything like that, it was always good to know not only what the voltages are, but also what the resistance of the injectors is supposed to be and all this stuff. You can fix a lot more vehicles if you know the good ones well enough to recognize the bad ones. That's the point. It's using oscilloscopes. You can build you an pattern library, and there's a Facebook page or two that have these picoscope patterns that are stored for cam and cranks. They'll have cam and crank. They'll have cylinder pressure waveforms and all that, and they'll typically have the car. This right here is a cam and crank waveform, and you have to be able to compare what you have to a known good one on those too. And some of your automotive websites will have that available for you. IATN, you can actually, if you subscribe to that, they've got known good waveforms. They got a huge waveform library. They'll share waveforms with you. But I started collecting waveforms from some of these Facebook pages, where these people will post what known good waveforms, and I save them and I put them in folders and stuff like that. Anyway, that was you can do that, but you also need to have the best scope you can afford. Now, this 2002 PT Cruiser it was high mileage, and it was bucking and jerking when it was driving, and sometimes it would stall and it wouldn't restart. Okay, so what do we know about this thing? We got to figure out. It came to mind as I was talking about this. My neighbor bought his daughter a PT Cruiser, and whenever I saw that he had bought it, I walked over and I said, "Those like to overheat." And he just, said, "Oh, okay." And about 2 years later, I saw him and his father-in-law working on it in the driveway, and I yelled as I was leaving, I said, "Hey, did it overheat?" He said, "Yep." I said, "Replace the radiator, the cooling fan, and the thermostat and see what that does." And he said he did that, and that fixed the car. That's usually what's wrong with a PT Cruiser, and you can drive yourself nuts, checking all kinds of stuff. I've seen those PT Cruisers have a fan, when I do my fan test where I hook a test light in series with the fan motor and turn it through to see if the light should be on all the time. I have seen them where there was only one segment on that whole 360-degree rotation that would light that light, and all the rest of it was dark. And so there's just, typically radiator, cooling fan, and thermostat. If you put all three of those on there, you'll typically fix an overheating problem if you don't have something like a blown head gasket or a water pump that the impeller has come loose on or something like that. But the mill was on this one. I had these codes stored. This is an actual photograph. It's an older photograph. You can tell because it's somewhat pixely. These were the codes that were stored on that. PO320, crankshaft position sensor circuit, camshaft position sensor circuit, P1391, loss of camshaft crank. That was synchronization. So our interpretation, based on what seemed to be good logic, was that the cam and crank signals were out of sync, because she told us that a shop had just replaced her timing belt, and this happened right after the timing belt was replaced. Now, she may not have been totally transparent with us. It may have been happening before the timing belt was replaced, and she had the timing belt replaced trying to fix this. She didn't tell me that, though. She said after we had the timing belt replaced, then it started doing this. Now, why she didn't go back to the shop that replaced the timing belt, I don't know, but people do that sometimes. They'll take it to shop A and pay them $400 or $500. It's still not fixed. They take it to shop B, they pay them $400 or $500, and it's still not fixed. And then they try to go back to shop A, and shop A says, "Hey, you've had it at another shop. It's not our problem anymore." See, I always tell customers, if you go to a shop and you didn't like the work that was done because it's not right, go back to that same shop and get that shop to straighten it out. That's the smartest thing you can do. If they refuse to straighten it out, you may have a small claims court thing, but in order to prevail on that, you have to tell the shop that you're willing to pay whatever they charge, you just want your car fixed. And if you pay whatever they charge and your car is not fixed, then you have a case. But if they say you need $2,000 worth of work and you'll only okay 800 of it, then you don't have a case if it's not fixed, because you didn't let them do all the work. And so I heard a judge say that one time when this lady was going to court about her car not being fixed, because she wouldn't let them do all the work, but she was trying to sue them because the car wasn't fixed, and she lost that. All right, this one here, something complicated. This was the PIDs kept indicating a loss of cam crank sync, reinforcing what we were already thinking. Of course, it depends on how clear you're thinking too a lot of the time. And so there was she seemed like she had gone to the dealership too, and they had estimated a huge, gigantic amount of money that they were wanting her to pay or whatever. But so here we were flying into this, and we were able to duplicate this. We could duplicate it driving it. She showed us what it was doing, and we could duplicate it in the service bay when we were torquing the engine and all that. It would cut up and intermittently. See, it seems to me like if the timing belt was out, it ought to do it all the time, maybe, but weird things happen. Well, we saw a new cam sensor the other shop had installed when they were, trying to fix something, but the vehicle was, and I don't know if she had initially gone back to the other shop or not, or where this cam sensor was put on, I forgot. But that cam sensor had been replaced. It's right on the end of the head, and that's what it looked like. The crank sensor is behind the engine block. You got to raise this thing up in the air to get to the crank sensor, and it's right on the back of the engine block. Right there, like you see it right there. That's actually a picture of the one on this vehicle. And the crank sensor had not been touched. You notice it's still got all the dirty crud all over the connector and all that kind of thing. You can tell that nobody has touched this crank sensor for a long time. Okay, so we also found when we disconnected the crank sensor that it was full of oil. Now it goes into the block area where the splash oil is, and it actually reads off of a wheel on the crankshaft. So we say, well, this thing is leaking internally and it's gathering oil that's puddling up in this connector. So we replaced the sensor and we cleaned the connector with electrical contact cleaner and washed that stuff out of it. And we connected a timing light, which I like to connect a timing light with long leads and tape the trigger so it's flashing all the time, put it in the floor of the vehicle and drive it and see if the timing light flash goes crazy when the skipping is happening. That way you can tell it's some ignition related problem. And it seems like we should have seen something here, but we didn't find anything conclusive that way. The tachometer needle would go nuts when it happened. Even during those starts, the fuel pressure was good. So I'm saying, okay, we're gathering information and we're sorting it out, trying to figure out how we can vector our way in. Well, we got this Intero PDA scope connected, and we did a cam crank comparison. And look at this is the good pattern on the bottom, and look at the difference here. Now, what you got to do when you're looking at this pattern is you want to see, where this cut takes place in relation to the bottom one. That'll tell you if the cam and crank's out of line with one another. Now, this one here, the pattern that we had here, that we got, that was published by Chrysler, started out with 4 on TDC, 2 on TDC, and then 1 and then 3. Well, see, the way that our pattern was captured, we wound up with 1, 3, 4, and 2, which that's the firing order up here like this. But look at where the cut takes place. If you look at this, see that right there, how close that is? Now look at number 1. See, this is supposed to be right in the middle, right here. See how it's supposed to be right in the middle? Okay, wait a minute. Let me make sure I'm in the right place. Oh, here we go. See that this up right here before 1 is right here. Okay, so now this, erase that. If you look at the way that does, see that's the trail and the edge of that 210-degree window there. Look how it's way out of line over here. I mean, you're thinking, well, this should be over here. In other words, this one right here should be cutting through right about here somewhere, and so it's a little out. I mean, they were all a little out. If you looked at the way they were, you got to look at the line up and see how that is. Anyway, says, well, it looks like the timing belt may be out of time. What are we supposed to think? You know what I mean? And so we basically had them go ahead and check the timing belt, and there was nothing wrong with the timing belt. Everything was fine. And, that's how this is supposed to look. So I applied some gentle turning force to see if these knock pins right here that go in here, if those pins are sheared or out of place or fell out or whatever, then you can move the cam gears back and forth, and it would mean that there was some sort of a dynamic thing going on. Like on some of the Escorts, whenever somebody didn't tighten the balancer good, and it was one of those balancers you could just pull off with your fingers even if everything was normal. Some of those they wouldn't tighten the nut enough to hold the balancer on, and that balancer with the weight of it would bounce back and forth, and it would waller out that keyway, and so that the balancer was able to move back and forth. When the balancer moves back and forth, it's got that crankshaft sensor 36-1 wheel on it, and whenever it moves back and forth, the ignition timing changes. You can change the ignition timing on one that's got a crank sensor by re-indexing that pulley that's got those 36-1 tooth on it. And this one, sometimes on those Escorts you'd take off and they wouldn't have any power. Next time you take off they'd feel normal. When I got under there and jacked it up and pulled the wheel off, I could take that balancer and move it back and forth about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch, because the keyway was wallered out because they didn't tighten the nut. And most balancers press on, but those didn't. Toyota Camrys are another one. You can take the Toyota Camry crankshaft bolt out, and you can pull that thing off with your hand, you know, so you don't have to pull every one of them off with a puller. Anyway, so we didn't really find anything there, so we put all that back together. It's not out of time. Don't know what the deal was on that scope pattern. So the bucking and jerking was easy to duplicate. We needed to disregard the scope pattern at this point. We didn't want to chase that rabbit anymore because it wasn't leading us to a solution. And we knew there was some issue with the cam and the crank signal. So we basically, you know, about 80% of the time it would run perfectly anyway. It only happened periodically. And so I started moving in a different direction. So we rechecked wire harness routing and condition. With the engine running and hot, I disturbed the wires at the cam sensor. In other words, I got my hand over here and, wait a minute, and I wiggle the wires leading to this cam sensor over here, and I got nothing. Didn't see anything there, even though we're getting cam codes, right? Okay, so the next thing that we did, we wanted to also see if the, you know, the wire harness was dragged across the sharp edge or something like that, and I've seen that before. And pinching and twisting the crank sensor wire with it in the air, somebody driving it in the air, I could pinch and twist the wires at this crank sensor right here, and I could duplicate this problem. Everything felt normal, but when I would jiggle it around, there was a situation we had on a 2006 Charger, and this guy would make a turn and the engine would stall, and he took it to the dealer and paid them $2,500 to replace the engine controller and do some more stuff. Nothing was fixed. It still did the same thing, you know. But I said, well, we need to see what the cam and the crank sensor are doing when this engine stall takes place. And so I got some straight pins and I back probed the cam and crank sensor wires at the engine controller. And when we had those things back probed and the scope connected to those pins, we could never, ever, ever duplicate that problem. But as soon as you pull those pins out, the problem was duplicated. What we had on that 2006 Charger was a pin fit issue, where the pins were just not touching. You know, they were, instead of being, you know, a good tight, they were like this, bouncing around in there. And whenever we would back probe it, we were pulling that thing out of shape a little bit, and it would make it a good connection where they never did that. And the engine controller on that one, I initially thought it was because he had some kind of a funky amplifier for his radio mounted right in there next to it, and I thought it was some kind of interference from that, but it turned out it was pin fit on those connector wires. But we replaced the pigtail. We had already replaced the sensor, and after we replaced the pigtail, and we got this one straightened out. Now, the problem started after a timing belt replacement, but was not caused by the timing belt replacement, if what she told us initially was true and that she didn't have the problem before they replaced the timing belt. Of course, you can understand why the customer would think something about the timing belt was causing it. But this, along with the misleading scope pattern, led us astray. Now, we ignored the cam crank codes that we should have been paying attention to. Because typically, even if your timing belt's out a little bit, you're not going to lose your cam and crank synchronization. We were near the problem when we found the crank sensor filled with oil. We were all over it. We had our hands everywhere where the problem was. But we replaced the sensor and cleaned the connector, but we should have replaced the pigtail. If we'd have done that, then we wouldn't have had any trouble. Of course, at the time, we figured cleaning the pigtail out was good enough. That oil must have got up in there and compromised where the wires were crimped, where it was making a connection to the, and that happens. You know, you'd be surprised what fluid and stuff will do to a connector. But at the very least, we should have wiggled the harness before overthinking the job and going off in the wrong direction. That was some overthinking that we did. We were going to gather us some data and we were going to sort it out. But it turned out that a lot of the choices we made, which seemed like wise choices, led us in a different direction than we needed to go. And so it's one of those keep it simple, stupid things, you know. And this particular time we weren't able to make a fix happen by doing all this fancy troubleshooting. And I'm not saying you can't trust your scope, but the scope is not the be-all, end-all in every situation, and this particular job proved that. And so there was our car bouncing in. Well, this is the end of the video, and I hope you guys have a great week, and let's all be careful out there.